Good morning. Welcome to our service this morning, and a special welcome if there's anyone here who is visiting. Please join us for tea or coffee afterwards. Now, today I'm going to do things just a little bit differently. Now, now, at this point, we usually light the Christ candle, but I'm not going to do that. Now, you'll notice that I've already got 4 candles burning, and I've got a big glass jar. I think our tradition of lighting the Christ candle to remind us that Jesus is the light of the world and that he is here with us is a really good one. But I'm doing something different today, not just for the sake of doing something different, but for a very specific reason. And that will become clear as we go along. So please bear with me and give me the benefit of the doubt, and let's just see where this goes. So let's begin our worship with a reading from Psalm 36. Your love, Lord, reaches to the heavens, and your faithfulness to the skies. Your righteousness is like the highest mountains, your justice like the great deep. You, Lord, preserve both people and animals. How priceless is your unfailing love, O God. People take refuge in the shadow of your wings. They feast on the abundance of your house. You give them drink from your river of delights. For with you is the fountain of life. In your light, we see light. Continue your love to those who know you, your righteousness to the upright in heart.
This reading is from John, chapter 7, verses 1 to 15. After this, Jesus went around in Galilee. He did not want to go about in Judea, because the Jewish leaders were there looking for a way to kill him. But when the Jewish festival of tabernacles was near, Jesus' brothers said to him, "Leave Galilee and go to Judea, so that your disciples there may see the works you do. No one who wants to become a public figure acts in secret. Since you're doing these things, show yourself to the world." For even his own brothers did not believe in him. Therefore Jesus told them, "My time is not yet here. For you, any time will do. The world cannot hate you, but it hates me, because I testify that its works are evil. You go to the festival, I'm not going up to this festival, because my time has not yet fully come." After he said this, he stayed in Galilee. However, after his brothers had left for the festival, he went also, not publicly, but in secret. Now at the festival, the Jewish leaders were watching for Jesus and asking, "Where is he?" Among the crowds there was widespread whispering about him. Some said, "He is a good man." Others replied, "No, he deceives the people." But no one would say anything public about him for fear of the leaders. Not until halfway through the festival did Jesus go up to the temple courts and begin to teach. The Jews there were amazed and asked, "How did this man get such learning without having been taught?" This is the word of the Lord.
Praise be to God. Our Bible reading today told the story of how Jesus arrived partway through the Festival of the Booths and began to teach in the temple. And it introduced us to the controversy that caused. And if you read on in the chapter, you will see how that controversy escalated. Now, we don't know the details of what Jesus was teaching. But the discussion about what was appropriate on the Sabbath suggests that some were asking questions about the things he'd done in the past. And in the previous chapter, we have Jesus teaching on bread from heaven and his statement, "I am the bread of life. Whoever comes to me will never be hungry, and whoever believes in me will never be thirsty." Now, this kind of teaching was probably still in the people's minds, especially at a festival that celebrated how God had provided food and water in the desert. And at least some of the people were questioning Jesus' authority to teach, mainly because he hadn't been trained as a rabbi in one of the rabbinic schools. Now, Jesus' statement that my teaching is not mine, but is his who sent me, might not seem very controversial to us. But at the time, it was extremely provocative. And the general public had mixed reaction, with some thinking that Jesus might actually be the promised Messiah. But the Jewish leaders understood that Jesus was claiming that his teaching came directly from God. As far as they were concerned, that was heresy, and they responded accordingly. They tried to arrest Jesus, but were unable to. And then we come to the last day of the festival. Now, as I said earlier, water was a very important part of the festival. Now, this reminded the people of how God provided water from the rock in the desert. And it also pointed forward to the last days when God would pour out his Spirit. There are several places in the Old Testament where water is linked with the Spirit, such as in Isaiah 44, verse 3. "For I will pour out water on thirsty land and streams on the dry ground. I will pour out my Spirit on your descendants and my blessing on your offspring." Now, on each of the 7 days during the festival, a pitcher of water was drawn from the pool of Siloam, and it was carried in a procession through the city and to the temple, and then poured out before God. Now, by the last day of the festival, they had seen this procession 7 times. And at the end of the last procession, as the water is poured out for the last time for another year, Jesus shouted out, "Let anyone who is thirsty come to me, and let the one who believes in me drink. As the scripture says, out of the believer's heart will flow the rivers of living water." Can you imagine the impact? The ceremony was over, and it wouldn't happen for another year. But Jesus was saying, you don't need to wait another year. In me, you can have a constant supply. And this living water then will flow from you to others. The pouring out of God's Spirit was about to happen, and it would happen through Jesus. The writer of John's Gospel then has a little aside to make it clear that this is what Jesus was referring to, though at the time people, even his own disciples, didn't really understand. Now, as you can imagine, there was a mixed response. Some of the people were convinced that he was the Messiah, But others said, "He can't be. He comes from Galilee. And the Messiah is to come from David's town." Now, clearly they weren't aware of where Jesus had been born. Now, the Jewish leaders pretty much wrote the crowd off as idiots. "We know the law and they don't." And once again, they tried to arrest Jesus. And once again, they failed. But this time, one of their own, Nicodemus, reminded them that their own law said that they had to give someone a hearing before judging them. Now, this happens after Nicodemus had had that private conversation with Jesus. We don't know, though, whether he had yet become a believer, but it certainly seems that he's thinking. And the Jewish leader's response? "So you're a Galilean too, are you? Look into the scriptures. No prophet can come from Galilee." Which wasn't quite true, because the prophet Jonah had come from Galilee. It had a different name back then, but that's the area he came from. But we don't want facts to get in the way of our argument or our prejudices now, do we? I think we're all probably aware of certain towns or certain suburbs having a bad reputation and not being desirable places to live. In the first century, at least in the minds of many Jews, the whole region of Galilee, and especially the town of Nazareth, was the place you didn't want to live. So this was a very big insult to Nicodemus. Then as we continue on through our reading, we move into the beginning of chapter 8. We have the story of the woman caught in adultery. But this story was not originally in John's Gospel. Now, we know that because some manuscripts have it here, some have it at the end of John's Gospel, some omit it, and one manuscript even has it in Luke's Gospel. Now, that doesn't mean it isn't a true story. It just means that it originally wasn't included here. Now, most commentators think that it was a story that circulated on its own, and that at some point in the copying process of manuscripts, it was included here. So I'm not going to deal with that story today. That story is a whole sermon on its own. But if we jump down to verse 12 of chapter 8, what we get is the continuation of the story of what happened when Jesus was teaching in the temple on the last day of the festival. As I said earlier, both water and light were important parts of this festival. Now, we get the theological background to that in Zechariah 14. On the day of the Lord, not only would there be abundant water flowing from Jerusalem, but it would be a unique day, a day known only to the Lord, with no distinction between day and night. When evening comes, it says, there will be light. Again, in that passage, we have a looking back to what God had done in the past, especially how God had guided them through the desert. But there's also a looking forward to what God would ultimately do. Now, there are numerous places in the Old Testament where God's work of salvation in the world is described as light. And that theme continues through into the New Testament, and especially in John's Gospel. Now, in this festival, 4 huge stands were set up in the 4 corners of the court of women. Now, that's the area where all the Jews, but not non-Jews, could go. And each stand had 4 large oil lamps. Now, I couldn't manage 16 oil lamps, so I've had to make do with 4 candles. Now, these lamps were lit at the beginning of the festival, and they were so bright that the whole of Jerusalem was illuminated for the duration of the festival. Now, some cities in the ancient world did have street lamps, but Jerusalem wasn't one of them. So this was a stark contrast to what the city was like for the rest of the year. But on the last day of the festival, the lamps were put out. And the city would be in darkness for another year. And that's the context when Jesus shouted out, "I am the light of the world. Whoever follows me will never walk in darkness, but will have the light of life." Can you imagine how startling that was to the people standing around and listening? As the lights that reminded the people of how God led them in the past went out, and the city would be in darkness for another year, Jesus said, "I am the light of the world." The Jewish leaders didn't like that, but they don't seem to have quite known how to handle it. So they questioned the validity of Jesus' testimony. And that led to a lengthy dispute in which Jesus makes several "I am" statements. Now, we don't have time this morning to go into the details of that discussion, but it culminated with Jesus' statement, "Before Abraham was, I am." And the Jewish leaders were so angry that they picked up stones to throw at Jesus. But he walked away, and they were unable to do anything to him. Now, you might be wondering why they were so angry. To understand that, we need to understand a little bit of the background. In both Hebrew and Greek, there are two ways of saying "I am." Now, the ordinary way, "I'm Evelyn and I'm leading the service today." And then there's the emphatic way, "I am Evelyn." Now, in the story where Moses met God in the burning bush, and God says, "I am who I am," when that was recorded in Hebrew, it used the emphatic Hebrew form of "I am." Now, the emphatic form in Hebrew of "I am" sounds a lot like God's name. Not quite, but it's very similar. So in certain circumstances, it came to be understood as a reference to God. And when the story of Moses and the burning bush was translated into Greek, the Greek emphatic form of "I am" was used, and it too came to be associated with a reference to God. And when John's Gospel reports these statements of Jesus, it uses the Greek emphatic form, "I am." So when you put Jesus' series of statements together, this is what you get. In chapter 6, "I am the bread of life." In chapter 7, "I am the source of living water." In chapter 8, "I am the light of the world," culminating with "Before Abraham was, I am." The Jewish leaders got the allusion to the name of God, and they understood that Jesus was claiming equality with God. That's why they acted so violently. They believed that was blasphemy, and the penalty for blasphemy was death by stoning. So they endeavoured to carry that out. Of course, it never occurred to them that Jesus might actually be telling the truth. So what does that all mean for us? We don't celebrate this particular festival, but we do have things that remind us what God has done in the past and help us to look forward to what God will do in the future. Individually, many of us have things in our past that we can look back to, where God guided us or intervened on our behalf or answered our prayers. And we have things that remind us that God continues to be with us. Corporately, we light the Christ candle that reminds us that Jesus is the light of the world and that he is with us now. We share communion, and that reminds us that Jesus' death and resurrection made it possible for us to come into a right relationship with God. And it looks forward to Jesus' return. But what about when we can't do those things? What then? When Jesus made the statements about water and light, he didn't make them in the middle of the festival. He made them at the end. It wasn't while everyone was watching and celebrating the ceremonies. It was when the ceremonies ended. When the things that reminded the people of their journey with God ended, Jesus' message was, I am bread, I am water, I am light, I am the way to God, and I will not fail. When we cannot perform our ceremonies, when the memory of what God has done in the past fades and we begin to wonder whether those things even happened at all, that's when Jesus says to us, I am bread, I am water, I am light. In me you find life and right relationship with God, and I will not let you down. We all have dark times. Whatever darkness we are going through, Jesus says, I am the light. Follow me and you will not walk in darkness. When we're at our darkest points in life, Jesus says, I am light. So what should our response be to that? Our first response should be one of faith and hope. But I know that when I'm going through tough times, sometimes I find it difficult to trust and to have hope. But Jesus' words here are the assurance that he is with us, no matter how dark the situation, and that he is the light that will enable us to keep going and to come out of the darkness. Ultimately, though, our response should be one of worship. If what Jesus claimed here is true, and of course we believe that it is, then our only reasonable response is one of worship. As you go out this week, may you remember that Jesus is the source of life-giving water. And may that flow on from you to others. And may you remember that Jesus is the light of the world, and that he is with you. And may his light shine through you to those around you.